On today's lesson, you'll be exploring through a website created by the USA Today on a topic that is difficult to read about. This is one of those topics we encounter during U.S. history class that sometimes can make us feel uncomfortable and uncertain, but is a topic that we must confront in order to move forward with this country. The title is Slavery's Explosive Growth in Charts: How 20 and Odd Became Millions. See how slavery grew in the United States over 2 centuries. Just over a decade after the Virginia colony was settled, a ship, the San Juan Bautista, set sail from Angola with an estimated 350 kidnapped Africans aboard. It was bound for Mexico as part of the burgeoning trade of enslaved people across the Atlantic. A twist of fate ended this tortuous journey on the colony's shores for more than 20 of the Bautista's enslaved Angolans. Their landing would presage a trade and industry built on African labor that would reach a staggering scale in the United States over 200 years. We see the continent of Africa with the ship the San Juan Bautista imaged over it, with white dots to represent the amount of Angolans that were kidnapped. We also see Luanda, Angola highlighted on the map. April through May of 1619, the San Juan Bautista, a Spanish ship of enslaved Africans, leaves Luanda, Angola, with about 350 kidnapped Africans. It's bound for Veracruz, Mexico. June 1619, an estimated 143 Africans die of disease during the ocean crossing. We see the path that the San Juan Bautista travels across the Atlantic Ocean, midway between Africa and South America. We see the amount of white dots on the San Juan Bautista go down by 143. As we continue to scroll, we see July 1619, and the line of the path of the San Juan Bautista travels to Jamaica. In Jamaica, the ship trades 24 African boys for supplies, and the amount of white dots on the ship decreases once again. As we continue to scroll, we see July 1619, and the ship's travel route continues into the Bay of Campeche, which is in the Gulf of Mexico. 2 English privateers, essentially licensed pirates sailing under foreign flags of convenience, attack the San Juan Bautista in the Bay of Campeche. The privateers take 60 Africans. So we see the number on the San Juan Bautista continue to be limited or decrease, and we see the Treasurer and the White Lion, 2 other ships, increase with their white dots. The remaining 123 Africans are taken to Veracruz, Mexico by another ship, which claims 147 Africans as its cargo. This is believed to include the 24 boys sold in Jamaica. And the travel route has arrived in Veracruz. August 1619, the White Lion arrives at Point Comfort, now Hampton, Virginia, carrying between 20 and 30 Africans. They are the first recorded Africans in the English colonies. So we see that route continue up to Virginia, and the White Lion, which had between 20 and 30 white dots, now has 0, as they've all off-boarded in Virginia. The Treasurer, that's the other ship, arrives at Point Comfort a few days later and leaves 2 or 3 Africans. And we see the number of white dots on the Treasurer decrease as well. The last 27 or 28 Africans are taken to Bermuda. That's off the coast of the United States, at this time the colonies, and the Treasurer has now decreased all of its white dots, representing those Africans that were stolen. Though a colonial census in March 1620 records 32 Africans living in Virginia, there is some debate whether all 32 were aboard the White Lion and the Treasurer. Some may have been there before their landing or have come in other ships from Europe. Not all may have been enslaved. Now we see an image with a white background and black figures and bodies, all in chains, dozens of them. A journey that led to death or slavery. Whichever ship they arrived on, these people represented the origins of slavery in the 13 colonies, and the journey here remained just as cramped, foul, and deadly for years to come. The Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, that's in Washington, D.C., estimates that, we see a chart here, the amount of Africans taken to the U.S. For every 1,000 Africans kidnapped in the trade of enslaved people, you see 1,000 black dots. 640 survived the forced march from the African interior. That means a lot of people died before they even got aboard a ship in Africa. 570 survived to board the waiting ship of enslaved people. So more died before they even left. And many died of disease on the ship. In the end, only 480 lived to see the Americas. After the 32 Africans landed in Virginia, that's the 32 bodies that we see, silhouettes, few Africans were taken to the colonies in next decades. So we see Africans taken to the U.S. starting in 1601 to 1610, and the number is at 0, and then we're going to see it increase, and the markings go 50,000, 100, 150,000, 200, 250,000, 300, 350,000 over the next 2 decades. So as we scroll, we see the growth of the slave trade was explosive over the next 150 years, rising rapidly from 1700 up to 1800, from 0 up to over 300,000. Hundreds, then thousands were captured and brought mostly to Virginia, Maryland, and South Carolina. So you see the largest amount of people is in South Carolina, then Virginia, Maryland, other, and then Georgia. But they all show increase. As Congress prepared to outlaw the slave trade in 1807, more than 24,000 Africans were brought to the U.S., the largest influx in its history. After 2 centuries, more than 360,000 Africans had survived the harrowing trip across the Atlantic. But they were just a fraction of the people who were born into slavery for generation after generation. We now see a map of the eastern half of the United States in 1860, with blue dots representing the amount of enslaved people. So it says, we'll try to put the growth in perspective. We see 1,000 bluish dots representing 1,000 enslaved people. Census data shows an escalating slave population by state, and we see the size of the circles representing 1,000 enslaved people being a very small circle, and as the circle gets larger, we're going to see that increase many, many thousands. And that's all across the East Coast in the original 13 colonies. We're in 1790 to begin. And as we scroll to 1800, we see by 1800 the total number of enslaved people had grown to 800,000. That's 1800. Continue to scroll to 1810, and we see that number grew 5-fold, from 800,000 to 4 million people as the Civil War started just 60 years later. So this is 1860 now, and we see the growth has exploded, accounting for the millions of enslaved people. Now we're seeing the number 16,390. Just how many people were enslaved since those original 32 Africans were taken ashore at Point Comfort in August of 1619? So we're seeing those 32 silhouetted bodies again. It's doubtful that question will ever be definitively answered. Population estimates before 1790 don't specify whether a black person was enslaved or free. We'll use this group of 200 Africans to show you what we do know. So now we see 200 silhouettes in chains. First, we know Virginia was the center of colonial slavery with a surging tobacco industry and its thirst for labor. By 1700, the black population grew to 16,390, the largest in the colonies. Each dot represents 200 enslaved Africans. In the first 100 years of slavery, more than 36,000 Africans were brought to the colonies. We now see dots representing 36,646 people. And we see them in an array of colors. We also know that the transatlantic slave trade brought 365,000 Africans to our shores in its 2 centuries, and that at least that many died before arriving in the colonies. So as we pan out, we're seeing now 365,603, and each of those dots is again representing some number of Africans, and we see it also in an array of colors. Pans out further, and we see by 1810, more than 1 million people were enslaved in the U.S., and cotton was about to take over the economy. We're now at 1.189 million people. Still in an array of colors. Even though the grueling work cut short many lives, the enslaved population more than tripled as cotton fed the U.S. economy in the 1800s, and the country veered toward war. And as we pan out, we see even more, almost 4 million, 3.9 million people represented by a colorful array of dots, and we're starting to see that those dots are going to be actually creating an image. Just how many Africans were enslaved? 2 historians estimated for USA Today that as many as 6 million people lived and died in the American industry of enslaved people before 4 million people were declared free by 1865, the end of the Civil War. And as we pan out, the dots get even smaller, but we see even more of them. We're up to 10 million now, and we're seeing that it is absolutely representing 2 of those people. 250 years, 10 million enslaved. And the dots have now blended into a animated image showing 2 people up close and many more behind them. A sun rising in the background. That concludes the exploration of how 20 and odd became millions.